Hello, listeners, and welcome to the next episode of the NKNews Podcast. I'm your host, Jacko Zwetsloot, and with me today is David Thompson, a senior analyst with the Center for Advanced Defense Studies. He was the primary researcher and author of the 2016 reports In China's Shadow, Risky Business, and the 4X Effect. David received his undergraduate degree in political science and Chinese language and literature from the George Washington University. He speaks Mandarin and has lived in China, studying at Peking University. He'll be speaking with me today about North Korea's illicit trade networks and sanctions designed to bring North Korea to denuclearize. Before we get started, I need to tell you about our NK News subscription giveaway, valued at $300. One random reviewer on the iTunes or Apple Podcast app per week will win that free membership, so do please review this episode and you might win. That will enable you to read all the stories that we refer to in the podcast, as well as lots of other excellent information available at nknews.org. Okay, David, welcome and thanks for coming today.
Thank you for having me.
So should I call your organization the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, or C4ADS, or how do you like that to be said?
We go by C4ADS, but I think both are equally good.
Okay. So what kind of group is C4ADS? What does it actually do?
So C4ADS is a Washington, D.C. based think tank. We're a nonprofit 501c3, and we do open source research into illicit networks around the world. That's everything from wildlife trafficking to the North Korea work that I do.
Who funds the center? How's that work?
So it's really a grab bag. It all depends on the projects, but it's everything from high net worth donors who are interested in conservation and wildlife trafficking to different grant-making organizations that are looking to make impacts in different spaces. Can
a donor say, for example, I'd like to give you some money specifically for conservation or specifically for North Korea-related research?
So the research is actually analyst-driven. You know, one of the analysts will think of a project, they'll try and put together a proof of concept and then pitch that to a donor that they think is going to be most interested in funding that.
I understand. Okay. And what brings you to South Korea this week?
So we like to get out of D.C. as much as possible to try and interface with people around the world to get a different view on some of the research that we're doing.
Can you explain sort of the overall methodology of your research work? How do you do that? And how does it work doing it from a distance in D.C.?
So all of our research is done using open source methodology. So for us, open source is anything that is publicly or commercially available.
So that can include what, media reports?
Right, so that's the whole gambit. We like to couch our research in as much official documentation as possible. Mm-hmm. So that's everything from official business registry forms to court documents to property records, etc.
Well, is this a reliable method?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think that with the official documentation, you're working at a quasi-judicial standard, so all of the information comes back from a official source, whether that is a state registry, a commercial database. And I think what's also most important is that the research is repeatable. I can give my thoughts on a specific network, but then I can also lay out the framework for how I found those findings and also the pathways in which that research can be repeated.
All right. And why is it important to be doing this kind of research, especially in the case of North Korea?
So I think one of the things that we're able to do is to provide information on some of these networks, which many people have thought was only available in the realm of government. And so we're able to highlight some of the different illicit activities that are going on, but in a way that can be made public, in a way that can be repeatable. People around the world can see that there are ways where we can identify some of this illicit activity, especially in the North Korea context.
In our very first NK News podcast episode, I interviewed Professor Andrei Lankov, and he said, based on his visit to northeast China, that North Korean trade in China is being choked off by sanctions, and he expects to see a major downturn in North Korean living standards by the latter part of this year as a result. Of course, he was talking about cross-border trade rather than international shipping. Could you give us an overall picture of how important shipping and trade is to the North Korean economy?
Yeah, so we see that as one of the largest revenue generation streams for the regime. It's something like half of the value of trade is done by ship. Any downturn in that activity is going to have a direct effect on the bottom line for the regime.
Now, of course, it's difficult to get any kind of overall bird's eye view of the North Korean economy. So how are we able to say that shipping provides half of the North Korean revenue?
So for the North Korean context, a lot of the things that we try and do is to recreate information that we're not going to be able to get from North Korean domestic information. Obviously, we'd love to get that data, but it's, unobtainable. So what we are forced to do is to try to create the mirror image of that information. And so one of the methods that we've used is customs and trade records. And so, we won't see the North Korean companies which are involved in this type of activity, but you'll see the other side of things. So for example, we can look at the trade records in China to see how much business is going on between China and North Korea, and then derive from that the additional findings.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. Now, can you give us a picture of how the current regime of UN sanctions against North Korea are actually supposed to work?
So right now there's been a lot of movement in the sanctions regime, obviously, with the passage of the new resolutions. Right now what we see is a lot of the sanctions are targeting sectoral bans, so trying to outright deny the regime from revenue generated by things like coal or iron ore or seafood products, etc.
Okay, now we have, of course, different kinds of sanctions regimes. There's UN sanctions, there's unilateral sanctions. So could you give us a bit of a picture of what that looks like?
So I think that's a tough question to answer in terms of giving an overall image of what the total of all the sanctions programs are looking like. A lot of them are targeting different aspects of the regime's illicit activity. So, for example, the sectoral bans are going to go after revenue streams, but there are also more targeted sanctions that are going to go after specific illicit networks. So really within that matrix, there's a lot of different pieces in play to try and prevent the regime from pursuing its WMD program.
So which sanctions do you focus on in your research?
So we like to look at the system kind of in two ways that are interlinked. On one side, the procurement aspect of these networks, the specific networks involved in trying to purchase restricted materials, whether that is for the WMD program or just broader sanctions violations such as luxury goods. And the other half is in the financial side of things. So looking to see the specific networks that North Korea is using to violate sanctions on the financial side, that money being used to fund the procurement arm.
Okay, so United Nations and US unilateral sanctions.
Correct.
What would an effective sanctions regime look like? What would we expect to see if they were working as intended?
Well, there are a lot of different outcomes for sanctions. I think there are a number of different answers to that question, and I think that is kind of hard to answer in terms of giving specifics. But there are a number of ways I think that the sanctions are being used to squeeze the regime, so that's kind of a hard one to answer.
But would I be correct in saying that basically what we're hoping to see is that North Korea will cry uncle and say, okay, let's negotiate?
Yeah, I think that the economic coercion that is kind of being put in place by some of these sanctions should create the leverage in order to bring North Korea back to the table.
Okay, how do sanctions often miss their targets?
I think rather than missing their target, a more thorough approach would be making sure that there is equal enforcement across all jurisdictions. I think there's a lot of issues that have been put in place in terms of making sure that there are effective measures to enforce some of these sanctions. And I think rather than missing their target, if fully enforced, the effect of the sanctions will be much greater.
All right, now could you help our listeners to understand a bit more just about what sanctions are and how they work? I understand there's primary sanctions and there's secondary sanctions. What does that all mean?
Primary sanctions are, sanctions against entities themselves, and secondary sanctions, like what we saw with Dandong Hongxiang, are sanctions enforced against entities which are helping sanctioned entities evade sanctions, if that makes sense.
So let me see if I understand this correctly. So if I'm a North Korean and I'm selling something and there's a mechanism in place to stop me selling that thing, that's a primary sanction against me. But if there's a mechanism that stops my trading partner from trading with me, that would be a secondary sanction.
Correct. I think a lot of the misunderstandings come in the scope and their intended effect. Again, there are many different ways that sanctions can be used to affect a target, whether that's in messaging or within creating that economic coercion. And understanding the intended effect of what the specific sanction is, I think, is something that is often misunderstood.
The intended effect being, as we said, to bring North Korea to the negotiating table.
Correct. But within that, I think there's a couple different ways that can be done. There's not really one overall type of sanction. I think what we see is that there are several different subcategories to make that happen.
And what did you mean about messaging? You said something about messaging being an important part of understanding sanctions correctly.
Yeah, so I think what we see often is that there are many different entities involved in sanctions enforcement, and that goes beyond the government level to people in the commercial sector. If appropriate messaging is done in terms of signaling that this type of business is going to be banned by entities like the United Nations or the U.S. Treasury, it's going to increase the risk calculus for a lot of businesses that surround these entities and scare them off from providing commercial services for them.
Now, when you say entities, you mean actually individuals as well as companies?
Yeah, I think what you see within the sanctions designations is there are several different subcategories of designations, whether that's against individuals, whether that's against companies, or even vessels.
Okay, now what do you say to people who argue that sanctions always hit the weakest members of a target state? If not exclusively, then at least first and foremost.
I think it all depends on where the targeting happens, and especially with the North Korea context, what we're seeing is most of the sanctions are going after regime elites, and so I think that targeting has been rather precise in some of the instances in which I don't think that is necessarily going to be the case.
Although, looking at Kim Jong-un and Kim Yo-jong in recent pictures, it doesn't seem like they're suffering too much.
No, not yet.
Is it possible then to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate North Korean businesses? And is there any point in trying?
I think North Korea provides kind of a complicated picture for that. Obviously, with such a hierarchical top-down management style, there's a lot of things that become fungible. Even if part of North Korea's business empire is sanctioned, they can easily move things around internally in order to remedy that by maybe pulling money from an unsanctioned part of their business empire.
That makes it difficult then to distinguish between different kinds of North Korean business entities, does it?
It does.
So is there a point in trying?
Yes.
Given that it's fungible and money can be moved around.
No, absolutely. I think that there is a lot of economic leverage that the international community holds over North Korea. I think that even though there are complexities to some of the sanctions programs and some of the ways that the North Korean regime is structured, that doesn't mean that there aren't vulnerabilities inherent in its economic situation. And I think through sanctions, we can enforce them in the right places. You can create that leverage in order to make the regime feel the pain of the international coercion.
In mentioning sectoral bans earlier, I think you mentioned maritime products, fisheries and things like that?
Yes.
Would you be opposed to a fish for daily necessities bartering program that allowed coastal villages to trade fish directly for food and other daily necessities?
I think I would need to know a little bit more about any specifics for those programs. I think the important part here is that the sanctions, if enforced and if properly targeted, are going to hit the regime's bottom line rather than the North Korean people's.
What are the different kinds of lists of people and companies that exist as part of the sanctions regime?
So it all depends on which list that you're going off of. There's the OFAC, Specially Designated Nationals list. There's also the UN sanctions list. And then there are sub-lists like the Department of Commerce entities list, which prevents trade from specific individuals that are not necessarily sanctioned, but included on those control lists. So there's a whole slew of different lists that are involved within enforcing these international sanctions.
Does Kim Jong-un himself appear on these lists?
Kim Jong-un appears on the OFAC's SDN list.
What's OFAC, sorry?
OFAC is the Office of Foreign Asset Control. It's the arm of the Department of U.S. Treasury that is responsible for implementing and enforcing sanctions. Okay,
now there are a number of North Korean refugees living here in South Korea, about 20,000 now, and also living in other countries in the United States and Japan and Europe. And these people reportedly send money back to their families in the form of cash remittances through Chinese brokers. Would such payments be affected either intentionally or unintentionally by international sanctions?
So often what we see is Chinese brokers playing a middleman role, not just in remittance payments, but in the illicit activity of these overseas networks. Many of these pathways have been closed by international sanctions for entities that are working on behalf of sanctioned North Korean financial institutions.
But how would that affect the individual from sending money back to the family then?
My understanding is that it would close down those pathways.
Which would not be targeting the elites then so much as the ordinary people.
Well, it all depends on whether or not if the companies involved are doing the majority of their business for the regime or for ordinary people.
Okay. In your first report, In China's Shadow, you write about the Liaoning Hongshang Group.
Sure. Dandong Hongshang was a large-scale China-North Korea trading firm that offered a variety of different services for North Korea, everything from trading coal to daily necessities across the border.
What's the status of that company now?
That company has since been shut down. It was found to have been acting as a financial proxy for Korea Kwamsong Bank, a sanctioned financial institution.
Was it the Chinese government that shut it down?
So it was an action done in tandem between the Chinese government and the U.S. government. The U.S. government sanctioned Dandong Hongxiang as well as its management, including Ma Xiaohong and the Liaoning Public Security Bureau.
Is this an example of what we would call a secondary sanction then?
Yes. Dandong Hongxiang was acting as a proxy on behalf of Korea Kwamsong Bank, a sanctioned financial institution, making payments for the regime overseas. Subsequently was sanctioned. The owner was a Chinese businesswoman named Ma Xiaohong.
And what's happened to her?
It remains unclear. She was put under investigation by the Chinese. She's been sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury, but the exact whereabouts and activities of her currently are unknown.
Now, what about the Chilbosan Hotel in Shenyang? That was also mentioned in your report as being the nexus of a number of different illicit activities.
We'd seen a number of reports of North Korean activity coming out of the Chilbosan Hotel. It was part of the Liaoning Hongxiang Group empire owned jointly between Ma Xiaohong as well as the North Korean government. We'd seen reports...
So it was a joint venture, was it?
Yes.
Okay.
We'd seen reports that it was the headquarters for Bureau 121, the North Korean hacker group. My understanding, yes, is that it has recently been shut down.
Do we have any eyewitness reports to testify to that? Do we know what's happened to the building? Is it literally shuttered?
I haven't seen it. I think maybe we should stop by.
Definitely. That does sound like an interesting place, yeah. All right, so just to dive into your research methodology a little bit more, can you cite a specific example of how you tracked company A to B to North Korea? Is there a story, where maybe you couldn't find a link at first, but then you found something and you got a breakthrough that pulled all the info together and you had a solid linkage?
Sure, I think the best example of that would be from the network involved in risky business. So often these things don't happen linearly. They kind of happen in disparate investigations. And so looking into the network surrounding the Jieshuen, the ship seasoned Egypt carrying RPGs from North Korea, we were able to pull back some of the ownership records for both the ship itself and the company surrounding it. And we're able to identify that it was owned by a Chinese national named Sun Sedong. Simultaneously, we were looking into more large-scale trading companies that were acting in a similar fashion to Dandong Hongxiang, importing large quantities of North Korean natural resources into China and selling them. By looking through the records and looking at all of the official documentation, we were able to establish that there were shared identifiers between the companies involved around Sun Sedong as well as the companies involved in Dandong Zhizheng Metallic Material Co. Both groups have subsequently been sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury for assisting both in North Korean illicit overseas finance as well as in illicit procurement.
Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the 2003 case of a North Korean ship called the Bongsuho. I was living in Australia at the time, and this ship was caught by the Australian Navy and forced to come into port in Sydney. It was suspected of having dropped off 150 kilograms of high-grade Southeast Asian heroin onto the Australian coast. Have you ever heard of that case?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I have.
And that ship was ultimately impounded and then taken offshore and sunk by the Australian Air Force.
Mm-hmm.
As I said, I was living in Australia, so I met some of the sailors from the ship at the prison where they were being held on remand waiting for trial. And while I was there, I met a man who had been sent from North Korea with a lot of money to hire a top-quality lawyer. He was apparently one of 7 directors of the Bongsu Shipping Company that said that they were a privately held company, nothing to do with the government, 7 directors. And I wondered if you or if your group had been doing research back then, you might have been able to find other ships and companies linked to those people, I suppose.
I think that would have been a fascinating case to look at the time. Anything involved in that type of illicit shipping is something that's very interesting for us. And I would hope that we would have been able to find more at the time. Yeah,
their cover story was that they were coming to Melbourne to buy a load of second-hand vehicles to take and resell, I think, either in Indonesia or Malaysia. But they never actually came into port. They faxed a cancellation of the order while offshore. So... the only thing that they were supposed to have done was to drop off that high-grade heroin. But the interesting thing was that they had 2 men on the ship who were sent in a rubber dinghy with the heroin to the coast. The weather was rough, the dinghy overturned, 1 man drowned, and 1 man was left on shore, and the police picked him up. But his name was not listed on the ship manifest, and he wasn't actually North Korean, he was a Chinese national. So the North Koreans on the ship said, "We don't know this man, nothing to do with us, you won't find any heroin here." If I recall correctly, the Australian Federal Police was never actually able to prove the case in the court that the North Korean ship had been the source of the heroin. So while they caught the people on shore with the heroin, the people on the ship were actually ultimately turned loose and sent back to North Korea.
We see those kind of deceptive practices happening all the time in terms of North Korean shipping. They know that people are watching and are trying to take as many steps as possible to remove themselves from the illicit activity.
Yes, I think you mentioned in one of your reports that you'll have to help me with the details here, but that somebody said, please don't make any calls or send faxes relating to this because we don't want people to track what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think what we see often is that the companies around North Korean business know that there is a large amount of risk involved. And so by trying to put as many layers in between them and this activity as possible, they're trying to protect themselves.
Now, the conclusion of your risky business report, it's very strong. You argue basically that North Korea's illicit financing and procurement system is vulnerable to being dismantled by effective use of sanctions. So do you think that North Korea won't be able to adjust if these key nodes or choke points are eliminated?
No, I think that adaptation is something that the international community is always going to have to address. But I think that there are vulnerabilities inherent within this system that allow for groups like the UN and U.S. Treasury to address it in a way that economic leverage can be used in order to pressure the regime.
Do you worry that sanctions will lead to every North Korean business searching out sketchy Chinese partners, perhaps creating an explosion in their illicit networks?
I think that there is a level of centralization that's required in order for the regime to maintain oversight on its overseas activity. Because of this, there is a limit to the way that these networks can be managed.
So you think that there's not that much autonomy in the way that North Korean entities operate?
I think that there are choke points that have to be maintained in order to have that top-down oversight. And if there are an explosion in networks, the systems will become more and more inefficient, which is going to increase costs for the regime.
Now, we know from your reports some creative ways in which North Korea tries to get around sanctions by, for example, exporting coal when sanctions forbid that. Could you remind our listeners why North Korea is prohibited by sanctions from exporting coal, specifically?
Coal has been the top revenue-generating export for North Korea for a while. I think in 2016, prior to the sanctions, it was something like 46% of the revenue generated by North Korean exports. That type of revenue is something that's very important for the regime to maintain, and so using these different tactics in order to continue to export coal in the face of sanctions is something that's very important.
Okay, but unlike in the case of, say, luxury goods or dual-use materials, coal is not a naughty product. Why is coal being targeted?
Coal is being targeted for its effect on the regime's bottom line. If you can prevent the regime from bringing in, over $1 billion a year from its sale, it's something that can really have a direct economic effect on the regime's bottom line.
So this is basically a very broad brush approach to hurting North Korea economically.
Correct. This is an example of some of the sectoral sanctions that we were talking about earlier.
Okay, now can you tell us specifically about the recent case of the Yuan and the Sky Angel?
Sure. So that is an example of North Korean sanctions adaptation that we're seeing in real time. The Yuan is a Chinese ship that was loaded with coal in Wonsan port, which had sailed up to the eastern Russian port of Komsk, and unloaded its coal there. And we see that, it wasn't alone in doing that. There were several North Korean flagships that had started to drop their coal off as well at this small port that actually hadn't seen a North Korean flagship berth there in over, I think, 2 years. We then see other ships, notably the Sky Angel and a few others coming to pick up that same coal and deliver it to ports in Japan and South Korea. We're seeing this added level of deception within these coal exports kind of right as the restrictions on coal are being put in place.
Okay, so you take this coal to Russia, unload it from a Chinese ship that's come from North Korea, load it on a different ship, and now it looks like Russian coal.
Correct.
Okay, and then it can be sold anywhere in the world as Russian coal.
Right.
But it seems very inefficient, though, to be taking a large load of coal, which you have to, first of all, load it into a ship and then ship it somewhere, unload it from a ship, and then load it into a third ship. Aren't there a lot of costs involved here that make it financially not so worthwhile?
I think so, and I think what that shows you is the value of these exports, even in the face of these sanctions. The need to raise this money for the regime is still there. And in addition, I think what you're seeing is the effect of sanctions in order to raise costs on the regime, right? Rather than one ship picking up the coal in North Korea and dropping it off in a foreign port, it now requires, 2 or 3 ships.
Do you want to take a guess as to what percentage of the price of coal is being lost in this chicanery?
I think that would be hard for me to say, but I think what's important is that is the direct cost which is being applied to the regime by these sanctions.
Okay, and was it C4ADS that actually uncovered this case? Is that your research that brought it to light?
I think that there were a number of groups involved in this. I don't think that we can take credit solely. That these types of cases are important to uncover and make public in order for more people to understand what North Korea is doing.
Okay, do we have any idea how big the overall North Korean merchant marine fleet is?
I think that that's a hard question to answer. We have numbers of the amount of North Korean flagged vessels, and that's somewhere in the range of around 400. But what we see is that often there are foreign flagged vessels which are assisting North Korea, either owned outright by North Korean linked entities or assisting the regime for commercial benefit.
Do you remember how many are mentioned specifically in your reports?
In our initial report, the number is 147 ships. But those were within 1 degree of separation from our 39 North Korean-linked initial fleet.
Okay, so we know that there's 400, but there may be more.
Oh, there's many more. I think that the 400 number only reflects North Korean flag vessels, but the additional ships involved in assisting the regime, there could be maybe another 200 or 300.
Wouldn't most North Korean ships be flagged as North Korean ships, or would most of them actually be operating under a flag of another country?
The North Korean flagships obviously are going to draw attention by the fact that they are North Korean flagged. And so what we see is if they're exporting coal within the region, they'll be North Korean flagged. But often what we see is ships traveling farther afield are going to be using flags of convenience in order to hide their ultimate beneficial ownership.
Now, do we have any idea about how often North Korean ships get bought or built or change hands? I mean, is it a very active fleet, or are they running on old ships?
Well, what we do see is that often these ships are moved in between companies. They have their names changed often, and even their flags change rather frequently.
Is that easy to do, changing the flag of a nation, of a ship?
It's not too hard, I think. What we see, especially in the North Korean context, as ships are discovered, as the companies behind them are wound up and disbanded, they'll be moved to different companies, have their names changed, and sometimes even have their flags changed.
Is that simply a paperwork process? Just filing something in a different country and bang, you've got a new flag? Is it as simple as that?
My understanding is yes.
Okay, so you don't actually have to bring the ship to said country to register it and have it inspected or anything like that. It's just a matter of filing the right paperwork.
No, and what we've seen actually is that certain North Korean commercial facilitators, which have come up over and over in different UN panel of experts reports or media reports, have actually acted as managers of some of these flag registries in the past.
Okay. What are some of the most common flags of convenience that we've seen North Korean ships be sailing under?
So it's a real mix. We've seen things like Togo, Cambodia, Tanzania, Sierra Leone. There's really a whole number of different flags that they've used.
Are there any landlocked countries that are flags of convenience?
We've seen North Korean ships fly under the Mongolian flag before as well.
Okay. None from Austria?
I don't think so.
Or Switzerland? No? Okay. Now, your report, Risky Business, suggests that the chief or sole aim of North Korea's overseas networks is to circumvent international sanctions and continue its pursuit of nuclear weapons. Explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of these networks serve as proxies for services that North Korea would be able to otherwise have if they weren't sanctioned because of their pursuit of nuclear weapons. So, for example, a lot of the financial networks are running solely because the North Korean financial system is cut off from the broader international financial system.
Now, Risky Business, the report, also features a Chinese national named, and forgive my pronunciation here, Fan Myeon-chan. He is described as a veteran North Korean commercial facilitator. Do we know what motivates his involvement in this risky business? Is it family ties, ideology, money-making?
We don't know his motivations, but we have seen him in a number of instances of North Korean illicit activity.
And is he believed to still be involved now, even after your report's release?
We've seen him on a number of companies involved in different instances of North Korean illicit activity.
Are you able to tell us anything about North Korea's involvement in cryptocurrency or virtual currency mining, trading, and theft? These are not mentioned specifically in your reports, but they have been mentioned in some recent media reporting. For example, Priscilla Moriucci, a former U.S. National Security Agency officer, has claimed that North Korea might have made as much as $201 million last year alone in cryptocurrency. Do you know anything about that?
It's something that we're very interested in looking into. It's not something that we have in the past addressed, but I think it's a great example of North Korean adaptation in real time again, moving into these more modern ways to generate revenue.
Okay, so we might see a report from C4ADS in future about North Korea's cryptocurrency networks?
Maybe.
If you need someone to help you with writing a snappy title, let me know, because I do like puns and alliteration. They're my stock in trade. So
Perfect.
I'll be happy to help you. This week, Tuesday, during high-level talks between a visiting South Korean delegation and Kim Jong-un that took place in Pyongyang, we saw the announcement of a summit to come, an inter-Korean summit in late April. And on Friday morning, Seoul time, we now have an agreement from President Trump to meet with Kim Jong-un. To what extent do you think that effective use of sanctions have contributed to these recent developments?
I think we'll have to wait and see the outcome of the talks, but I think that the impact of sanctions has been real. I'd be shocked if it hasn't factored into the calculus of the North Korean regime.
Page 12 of your Risky Business report contains a diagram showing linkages and flows among Chinese and North Korean entities. I encourage all of our listeners to go and have a look, because that's a freely downloadable report, isn't it?
Correct.
From your website. But could you sort of walk us through that diagram, David, and to just tell us basically how things work in a big picture?
So this diagram is based off of what we saw with Dandong Hongshang and the different roles that it was playing for the North Korean regime. What we see is that there is both a licit side of this business, though now much of that has been restricted by UN sanctions, and an illicit side. And in both of those roles, Dandong Hongshang was able to provide different services. So in this particular diagram, it shows the ways in which Dandong Hongshang was able to serve as a commercial broker for North Korean imports, in this case especially coal, where it could generate that revenue as well as satisfy the orders of North Korean trade representatives based in China.
What would be some examples of licit North Korea trade before, well, as you said, it's now been much shrunk by the recent sanctions, but what would it have been?
So it would have been things like coal, iron ore, seafood products, clothing. We see a lot of these moved at volume by companies such as Dandong Hongshang. So hundreds of millions of dollars being moved through this company into Chinese markets on North Korea's behalf.
Now, similarly, on page 14 of the same report, you have a diagram that shows how money and orders and goods flow between North Korea, China, and the rest of the world. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
So what this diagram represents is the illicit side of this business. There is a large amount of money generated by the trade in goods such as coal and iron ore that isn't sent back to North Korea. Rather, it goes through a system of financial proxies so that it can be used by North Korea's sanctioned financial institutions around sanctions. And so what this diagram shows is how that process works. Money's moved from the accounts of companies like Dandong Hongshang into the accounts of front companies located in Hong Kong, but also around the world. And the money in those accounts is controlled by North Korean overseas agents, which use it to then procure a whole range of materials, but have them sent back to Dandong Hongshang to be mixed in with the licit flow of goods that is going in between North Korea and China on the company's ships.
We've got a couple of summits coming up in the next month or two. As we said just before, that might be partly a function of sanctions working. What would you like to see coming out of those talks?
I think we'd all like to see some positive progress on the issue. The past year has seen a dramatic escalation in tensions, and I think any tangible steps in order to look for a nonviolent solution would be welcomed by me.
A good and positive note on which to end our interview. Thank you again to our in-studio guest, David Thompson from the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, for coming on the NK News podcast. Don't forget, listeners, you can listen to all of our shows as well as read full bios and show notes on our website, www.nknews.org. NK News is the leading repository of North Korean research, news and analysis, and we hope to see you there. And you can send feedback, comments, questions, or guest suggestions to podcast@nknews.org. Our podcast today was produced by Arias Dare and facilitated by Chad O'Carroll and Christina Lee. Lastly, a reminder that one random viewer on the iTunes or Apple Podcast app per week will win a free NK News membership, so please review us after listening and you might win. Hear me next time.